Hello, everyone. Geox is with you, is on your screen with the geopolitical news roundup for June 25th. Far more significant developments are unfolding outside the combat zone. First of all, Russia's fuel crisis continues to worsen. It is beginning to look like a nationwide catastrophe unless it is stopped immediately. According to reports coming out of Russia, the fuel shortage has now reached Siberia, where the harvest sowing operations, agricultural production is now under serious threat. Compared to last year, gasoline, diesel fuel, and other petroleum products have increased in price by roughly 2 to 3 times. Fertilizer prices have also climbed sharply. Meanwhile, agricultural prices are not rising. They're actually falling. As a result, by the end of this year, Russia could face a very serious food supply problem. And let's not forget, the fuel crisis isn't limited to Siberia. It's spreading across the entire country. That raises an obvious question. Where are the authorities? And what exactly are they doing about it? Experts are virtually unanimous. Physically, Russia has enough gasoline. That shouldn't surprise anyone. The country produces far more gasoline and especially diesel fuel than it consumes domestically. Under normal circumstances, there should be no fuel shortage whatsoever. Even the Ukrainian strikes cannot realistically explain what is happening. Although new data suggests Ukraine has successfully disabled roughly 25% of Russia's oil refining capacity for a limited period. That alone still doesn't explain the crisis. 25% is certainly significant. It's larger than the roughly 15% production surplus Russia previously maintained over domestic demand. Even so, that should not have triggered a nationwide fuel shortage. Russia still has massive fuel reserves. It has national stockpiles. It also maintains strategic petroleum reserves. Just look at how the United States handled oil during the recent conflict with Iran. Despite the sudden loss of roughly 11 million barrels of oil from the global market, a volume that couldn't simply be replaced oil, prices remained relatively stable. At first, they fluctuated between $100 and $125 per barrel. Later, they settled around $90 to $100. In fact, prices began falling even before the fighting ended. Despite the severity of the situation, the United States kept releasing large volumes of oil from its reserves onto the market. Markets remained calm because traders believed the conflict would eventually come to an end. As a result, oil prices continued to decline. Today, they have already returned to roughly their pre-war levels. So, the obvious question is this: how could relatively limited Ukrainian strikes trigger a nationwide fuel crisis in Russia when the country still possesses enormous reserves, including strategic stockpiles? And how could that crisis grow so severe that it now threatens the harvest season and potentially next year's food security? There's only one explanation. Ukraine isn't the real cause. Neither are sanctions. The real problem is the complete administrative paralysis of Putin's government. The system has become incapable of responding to a crisis. The so-called vertical chain of command no longer functions. Years of repression, wartime censorship, and the elimination of independent thinking of trained officials to react to only one thing: orders from above. Nothing happening on the ground matters anymore. Warnings from specialists, complaints from local authorities, signals from ordinary people. None of it reaches decision makers. Only directives from the top count. And those at the top receive nothing but optimistic reports. You can see the same pattern in Russia's military briefings. According to the Ministry of Defense, everything is always going perfectly. Better than even the most optimistic military bloggers could imagine. Putin lives inside those reports. He genuinely believes he's winning. Exactly the same mechanism now exists across every sector of government. Officials send reassuring reports upward. Senior leaders conclude that everything is under control. Then a seemingly routine disruption occurs. Supplies from Tatneft are interrupted. After that, a strike disables the refinery in Lyubitsy for an extended period. Instead of managing the problem, the entire administrative system collapses into panic. People rush to buy gasoline. Authorities respond with restrictions, rationing, and emergency controls. That is the textbook definition of administrative failure. It closely resembles what happened in the Russian Empire in 1917. There was no actual shortage of grain. The country had plenty of it. The real problem was transportation. The railway network had become overwhelmed by military logistics. Grain accumulated in southern Russia, but it never reached Petrograd or the country's major industrial centers. The transport system simply broke down. Grain piled up in the south. The north never received it, and eventually Petrograd exploded. The revolution swept away the monarchy in just a matter of days. Today, gasoline plays roughly the same role that bread played in 1917. Could a fuel crisis bring down Putin's system just as quickly? It's entirely possible. And if that happened, there might be very little he could do about it. Even Russia's millions of security personnel depend on fuel. People often forget that soldiers, National Guard troops, and police officers are ordinary citizens too. Yes, the military receives priority fuel allocations for official duties, but they still have families. They still drive personal vehicles. They still stand in line at gas stations like everyone else. And they're becoming frustrated too, watching the Russian government do virtually nothing to stop what is clearly a man-made administrative disaster. I'm increasingly beginning to wonder whether this crisis could evolve into a genuine black swan event, the kind of event that suddenly destroys an entire political system, possibly even at the very moment the Kremlin is considering some kind of extreme escalation against Ukraine. Why do I think that? Because Moscow has now announced internet shutdown exercises. And I warned you about this before. I said that when preparations for mass mobilization begin, internet restrictions will follow. Now, to be clear, this is not mobilization yet. Officials are calling it a drill, just like previous exercises conducted elsewhere in Russia. The authorities are testing procedures, testing control mechanisms, testing how society reacts. In Moscow, they're effectively saying, let's see what happens if we switch off the internet. Let's see how people respond. Let's practice doing it. And if they can do it in Moscow, they can do it anywhere. Russia appears to be preparing for a large-scale mobilization. Its international position continues to deteriorate. Internal problems are multiplying. Now, a fuel crisis is emerging on top of everything else. That combination could disrupt every plan the Kremlin has. So, pay close attention. These developments are becoming increasingly important. And here's the key point. There is no secret conspiracy. There is no hidden power center directing events. History doesn't usually work that way. In 1917, nobody expected revolution either. Nobody had a master plan. Just weeks before the February Revolution, even Lenin was pessimistically writing that his generation might never live to see a revolution in Russia. Just 3 weeks before the revolution, Lenin wrote that people of his generation might never witness such an event. Achi, that moment the Bolsheviks were in prison. Their leadership had been arrested. The government believed everything was under control. The Tsar had gone to the front because there was supposedly nothing to worry. About in the capital, the Empress remained at the royal residence. The political establishment saw no immediate danger. Then, almost overnight, everything collapsed. Within a single week, the entire system fell apart. That's how these moments unfold. They emerge suddenly. They grow out of problems almost nobody considers dangerous. Belarus. Russia has plenty of fuel, so how could there possibly be a fuel crisis? And yet, here it is. Not because the country lacks resources, but because the system is incapable of managing them. For years, I've argued that Putin's vertical system of power has an extremely low level of administrative competence. Now, we're beginning to see what that really means. Large-scale failures don't always arrive gradually. They often appear without warning. One day, everything seems stable. The next day, the crisis is already underway. That is exactly what a systemic collapse looks like. The Kremlin is simultaneously preparing for possible mobilization, while an unexpected domestic crisis strikes from an entirely different direction. Putin remains focused on military operations, still pointing at villages on the map, while an administrative disaster develops behind his back. This is how seemingly solid political systems begin to crack. From the outside, they appear strong. Everything looks tightly controlled. Every screw has been tightened. Every institution seems firmly in place. Of course, it's still possible that the situation stabilizes, but the processes unfolding right now are remarkably unusual. We haven't seen anything like this in a very long time. The last comparable moment I remember was during the late 1980s, when Soviet Communist Party authority began to weaken. Even so, today's circumstances are different. This doesn't remind me of 1989. It reminds me much more of late 1916 and early 1917. We'll see whether that comparison proves accurate. After all, that's exactly what defines a black swan event. It emerges unexpectedly. Almost nobody predicts it. Nobody knows precisely what comes next. All we can do now is continue watching as events unfold. At the same time, Russia is finding itself in an increasingly difficult position internationally. The so-called spirit of anchorage has completely evaporated. Meanwhile, Ukraine continues striking targets deeper inside Russian territory with drones, and now with missiles as well. The missiles are flying. Yes, there are questions about their performance, but that's beside the point. They're reaching their targets, and they're not being intercepted. I've asked this before. Where is Russia's air defense? Why weren't these missiles shot down on their way toward Cheboksary? Now, they've reached Voronezh and other regions as well. And once again, they aren't being intercepted. Reports claim that Putin has concentrated most of Russia's air defense around just 3 locations. Moscow, Valdai, where he reportedly spends much of the summer, and the Crimean Bridge. The rest of the country is increasingly exposed. As these strikes continue, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says he intends to carry out what he describes as a 40-day campaign designed to force Russia into peace. Think about that for a moment. Ukraine is openly saying it intends to compel a nuclear power to negotiate. A remarkable statement, and Moscow has offered no meaningful response. Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov admitted that the so-called spirit of anchorage no longer exists. Then U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio clarified something even more significant. According to Rubio, there was never any agreement in the first place. There was only a proposal. In other words, the United States rejected Moscow's expectation that President Trump would pressure Ukraine into reducing military operations. At the same time, Russia faces growing internal difficulties. France recently intercepted another tanker carrying Russian oil. The vessel was sailing under the flag of Cameroon when it was seized in the Mediterranean. President Macron publicly announced the operation. Supporters describe it as sanctions enforcement. Critics describe it as outright piracy. Either way, the cargo was Russian oil. Then came another development. British authorities announced that oil seized from one of these tankers would be sold. That represents another major escalation. Yet the most striking part is not what Western governments are doing. It's Russia's response. Or rather, its lack of one